Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the newest program in the Green Ribbon Commission Climate Action Exchange Series, Inspiration, Empathy, and Education, How Cultural Entities Are Helping People Think About Climate in New Ways. My name is Amy Longsworth. Along with my colleague, John Cleveland, we staff the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. GRCx is an interactive virtual program designed to support the GRC mission of accelerating the implementation of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan. I have to say, on a personal note, I have been looking forward to this session, this GRCx program, for a very long time. I'm super excited about it. It takes us into a new realm of culture and the arts, and what that sector is, how it's interacting with and furthering the climate cause. So climate work has really long been situated in the domain of science and policy, making it something of a specialty, even though it affects all of us. In recent years, however, artists and cultural institutions have developed a powerful interest in the topic, and there's an evolving understanding among educators and community and political stakeholders that in order to have an impact, messages need to come from a variety of interdisciplinary sources and perspectives. And when presented from these different vantage points, discussions related to climate change can deepen the appeal to diverse audiences and promote innovative approaches to understanding the issues, and inspire empathy and sound a clarion call to action. So this GRCx program will highlight three such approaches: the Emerald Necklace Conservancy's Olmsted Now initiative, the Harvard Museum of Natural History and Culture's In Search of Thoreau's Flowers exhibition, and the Leventhal Map Center's More or Less in Common, Environment and Justice in the Human Landscape exhibition. And the program will consider how cultural institutions are particularly well equipped to document and interrogate the long time horizons of climate change and resilience. And it will also explore the critical role that institutions can fill, cultural institutions can fill, in showcasing the intersections between climate history, racial equity, public health, and empathy. Next slide. Today's program was developed in collaboration with the Green Ribbon Commission's Cultural Institutions Working Group. It's our first one. And their collective programming initiative, Action Packed Boston. And you are looking at a slide from the website, Action Packed Boston, which I encourage you to go to, actionpackedboston.com. You can find all kinds of cultural climate programming going on in Boston under the Events tab. And what Action Packed is, or the Cultural Working Group, is a consortium of 40 arts, science, history, natural resource, sports, and entertainment organizations, all committed to protecting Boston from climate change. And members of this group are committed to three things. One, driving public awareness and action on climate change issues. Two, developing climate-focused programming. And three, creating climate action plans for their own institutions to increase their resilience and significantly reduce their carbon footprints. Next slide. So before we begin, before I introduce the panelists, we have a couple of logistical notes. One, the session is being recorded. Two, you don't need to take photos of the screen because shortly after the program's over, we will send you all the presentations and a link to the recording. If you have questions for the panelists, and we have about half an hour for Q&A, please put them in the chat box. That's where I'll be drawing the questions from that I will feed to the panelists after the presentations. And finally, please mute yourself if you are not speaking, of course. So today I'm really pleased to introduce three strong partners in our work to leverage the excitement of cultural programming for the serious purpose of fighting climate change. First up will be Karen Mauney-Brodek, the president of the Emerald Necklace Conservancy, which is working to restore and improve the Emerald Necklace's 1,100 acres for all Bostonians. Karen led the successful celebration of the Conservancy's 20th anniversary in 2018 with a presentation many of us will remember, Fog and Flow, a world-class exhibition of site-responsive art throughout the Emerald Necklace. And she is currently leading a major revitalization of Charles Gate Park with a neighborhood group, Charles Gate Alliance. And she serves on many other boards and groups related to the preservation of natural resources in the state of Massachusetts. Next will be Brenda Tindall, Executive Director, the brand new Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. Welcome to Boston, Brenda. She joined the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences as an award-winning educator and scholar from the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, where she served as founding director of education and engagement and led the launch of the museum's inaugural educational program. She also, prior to that role, served as director of education at the Detroit Historical Society during the start of its widely acclaimed Detroit 67, looking back to move forward. Oh, I've just received a note that Brenda is going last and Garrett is going second. So Garrett Nelson is a historical geographer. He is the president and head curator of the Norman B. Leventhal Map Center. His work focuses on the relationship between community structure, geographic units, and political ideology. Nelson joined the Leventhal Map and Education Center in 2019 after 3 years on the faculty at Dartmouth College. During his tenure at the center to date, he's managed exhibitions in the center's gallery, launched the digital exhibition Bending Lines, overseen development of new tools and resources to enhance access to the center's vast holdings, and designed and hosted public-facing community events that have brought the center and its work into critical local and regional conversation about people and places. And I just have to add this, that Garrett has a master's in landscape and culture, which I found fascinating because I did not even know that was a thing. So the order, I still have it wrong. Brenda, Karen, Garrett. I hope that's right. So I am now going to turn the slides over to you, Brenda. And thank you all very much for being here. And thank you to our audience, which is over 180 people today, which is fantastic.
Amazing. Awesome. Can you all see my screen? Excellent. Greetings. My name is Brenda Tindall, Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, and really delighted to be here. Before I begin my presentation in earnest, I'd be remiss if I did not share my deepest gratitude to Boston's Green Ribbon Commission Climate Action Exchange for facilitating this important conversation and for creating and holding space for cultural organizations like the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture and my colleagues on the panel to be in thought partnership as we all grapple with the impact of climate change. In my view, museums are not merely cabinets of curiosity, right? In fact, 21st century museums are uniquely qualified to be sites of new and active learning. On their best days, museums are places where visitors can be activated and encouraged to apply what they learn to make the world better than how they found it. In many ways, that's what has inspired my trajectory as a museum practitioner and indeed fuels my aspirational outlook as executive director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. For those that are not familiar with the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, our mission is to foster curiosity and a spirit of discovery among visitors of all ages, enhancing public understanding of and an appreciation for the natural world and human culture. From this vantage point, the topic of climate change has long been part of our educational, interpretive, and programmatic enterprise. In fact, we have long had a extensive and standing exhibition at our partner institution, the Harvard Museum of Natural History, entitled None Other Than Climate Change. This exhibition really draws on the latest scientific information about warming climate, the global and local consequences, and how to reduce the fossil fuel emissions that cause it, and prepare, frankly, all of us for its effects. This particular exhibition was done in collaboration with the Harvard University Center for the Environment and informed by Harvard-led research. Adding to this body of work, in spring 2022, we are delighted to share with you that we will be opening In Search of Thoreau's Flowers, an exploration of climate change, nature, and loss. This is an interdisciplinary exhibition and community engagement initiative that will integrate scientific inquiry and immersive visual arts to do, among many things, engage diverse and intergenerational audiences on this topic, deepen the public's science literacy, and above everything, build awareness of the impact of climate change on the natural world. Now, this exhibition is this project is not only an exhibition, it's also a community engagement initiative. But I will start with the exhibition because it really is the anchor through which we explore this topic. The exhibition centers on the historical and contemporary data related to phenological responses to climate. In addition, it uses the observations, plant specimens, and records collected by Henry David Thoreau, who was a 19th century naturalist and philosopher. And those records have been preserved and housed at the Harvard University Herbarium. In conversation with Thoreau's observations, specimens, and the records he collected, the exhibition also draws upon an extensive corpus of botanical data from multiple repositories throughout the Eastern United States. Now, the beauty of this is that collectively, these records document the profound impact of climate change on individual and entire plant communities, including trends related to spring flowering and leaf out times across 2 centuries, which really demonstrates, again, this real dialectic between the past and the present in exploring climate change as an issue that continues to impact us in the 21st century. You know, in many ways, when I think about someone like Henry David Thoreau, he becomes, in some ways, in this exhibition, a prism through which we explore the past and the present. And when you think about Henry David Thoreau, who was a son of Massachusetts, studied at Harvard, and deeply steeped in the discourses of his time, including being a naturalist and a philosopher, and being deeply engaged in the civil and human rights movements of his time. It really provides a wonderful vantage point for thinking about climate change and the issues surrounding climate change as being wholly steeped in the historical realities of civil and human rights issues, and climate change is at the center of that as we talk about this important topic. I think it's important to note that one of the things that is deeply important to this project is that we employ a multi-pronged and interdisciplinary approach. Again, as I mentioned before, it really is a dialectic between the past and the present. And we do this through records, specimen data that again span from the 19th to the 21st centuries. We're also deeply steeped in the data and the scholarship. We're collaborating with Harvard faculty members, including evolutionary biologist Charles Davis, who has been in the vanguard of efforts to investigate and understand phenological response to climate change. He also led the effort to digitize Harvard's herbarium collections. And then, of course, we employ what I think is a deeply important creative strategy using arts integration. We're working with renowned professional visual artists who have been commissioned to use digitized images and over 640 or so images of plant specimens to create an immersive art experience that really tracks the loss of species over time. Again, building on this dialectic between the past and the present, and frankly, a deeply important conversation on climate change that places science into conversation with art. Now, another important component of our In Search of the Rose Flowers initiative is our community engagement component. It is very clear that the topic of climate change has been, impacts us at our entire ecosystems, if you will. But sometimes that research has reached a very limited audience, often those who are proximate to the research, to environmental policy, have been particularly engaged in this conversation. However, In Search of the Rose Flowers has the potential through this sort of multi-pronged approach and interdisciplinary perspective to really expand beyond those that it has traditionally engaged with. Our hope is to expand the reach of this project through a variety of strategies. One, we want to partner with school districts and public libraries in Cambridge, Somerville, Chelsea, and Boston writ large to activate citizen science programs for K through 12 students. We also recognize the importance of having a virtual and digital presence. So we will have a companion virtual experience with interactive content that will allow the public to have access to the digital herbarium specimens that belong to our collection. And then, of course, as is tradition for the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, we plan to develop a suite of public programs and on and off-site guided visitor experiences for diverse and intergenerational audiences to explore the topic of climate change and its impact on local ecosystems. Again, we are at the very nascent stages of really developing and fully launching this project and wanted to provide a real high-level articulation of this important exhibition that we believe will not only reach the academic audiences that are important to our enterprise, but also the larger community for which we believe will benefit a great deal from both the science-based contours of this project, but also the immersive visual artistic experience that will be at the center of this important exhibition. With that, I will stop there. I know that there are other colleagues on the panel who will also talk a bit about the amazing work happening at their institutions. Thank you so much.
Brenda, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. And I know there'll be a lot of questions for you when we get into that territory. So very excited about what's going to happen in spring of 22. And now I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Oh, I have to go to the start. Turn off your eyes. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Mauney-Brodek, president of the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. Super excited to be part of this conversation today. I'm starting with really what I think about when I think about this topic, which is something that I have learned by working with one of my amazing colleagues, Kent Jackson, our director of education, and I'm sharing some of the photos of the young people in his program, specifically our Canopy Classroom program, where we work with kids, second and third graders, primarily from generally the Boston Public Schools classrooms and buildings, facilities that are near the Emerald Necklace. And this photo just lives with me, so I love it. And you know, I think what I want to talk a little bit about today is things I've been learning about through our programs working with Kent. I think many of us might know some of this intuitively, but there is something pretty special, I think, about taking a moment to think about why it is that by being together in parks together, or in public spaces together, that perhaps we develop a deeper sense of empathy. And I want to just share a couple of things with you. So one thing that Kent Jackson, our director of education, provided me this quote, and I think it is it's really illuminating about the fact that when you spend time in nature in one place on many different occasions, that you build an awareness of and a connection to and compassion for other things in that space. And the more you go, the more you begin to see the sacredness in all of those things that you did not see at the outset. Slowly, but ultimately, like many streams feeding a mighty river, you begin to realize that the sacredness is not confined to those things at your special spot, but it extends beyond to everything else in the universe. I think that's one of the things that is so special about parks, that they change every day, that nature grows and changes constantly. And if you visit it and you're with it and truly connecting to it, perhaps we each can begin to see the way that we connect with all of these systems and how we are all ultimately connected. And so though I don't think the Conservancy's explicit mission is to teach or connect people to the challenges of climate change, I think inevitably, if we are doing our work right, if we are connecting with park users and the public, and they are finding a way to connect to the parks, that will be a wonderful byproduct. To mention a little bit about what the Emerald Necklace is, for those of you that that may not know, that may be joining us from elsewhere. The Emerald Necklace is a system of parks that were designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in the 1870s, starting in the 1870s and completing in the 1890s. Though I think many of us would say it's an ongoing project today to try and realize everything that that these parks could be for everyone. And they connect through the heart of Boston. The portion that Olmsted designed started at Charles Gate Park, but the Charles River, and stretches to Franklin Park. Here is the thing that I think is really, one of the things that I think is so important about the Emerald Necklace that is perhaps less understood because the parks are designed in such a naturalistic way, is that it actually is the first piece of green infrastructure that was developed really in the country by Olmsted. He essentially used the Emerald Necklace to address a major engineering challenge. I joke that it is a water park because it is. All parks are actually water parks, but some perhaps do more and more robustly to manage water than others. The Emerald Necklace is that is in fact its primary function. I'm just going to mention a little bit about the history. This is a map that that Garrett and I know well and talk about, but have talked about before. This is a map, an odor map, a map of the areas that you would want to avoid in Boston before the construction of the Emerald Necklace, where a map that shows some of the sources of perceived offensive odors. And this was essentially the problem that the Emerald Necklace was trying to solve. of course, based on our desire to build our culture's desire to build land and buy and sell it and make more of it. We filled in waterways, those same areas that are the most likely to flood today. And we needed to come up with a way to manage stormwater, rainwater, and also the sanitary needs of the city during the industrialization of the turn of the century. And this essentially is the solution that Olmsted arrived to, and many of the solutions that are being used worldwide right now are based on this not new technique, though we did ignore it, this method, for a long time. Those of us from design fields like me, I think a lot about the fact that if we'd only been using something like this since the 1880s, we'd be in a very different situation than we are today in our cities. So that is how the Emerald Necklace sort of came about. And I think that in the experience of being in parks, perhaps you can better connect to these types of things. What we have, one of the projects that we're working on, to the left, we have the Franklin Park revitalization, the current condition of of Charles Gate Park, which is a hardened condition, which is a situation that was came out of the engineering and desire, the 1950s and 1960s, to control nature, which what we're learning is that is not the best way to address or handle the challenges of climate and essentially working with the forces of nature. And we're trying to reinstall Olmsted's techniques in these landscapes. So to the right, you see, one place we're trying to do that. It's these kinds of processes, these kinds of moments that we can provide the public, work with the public to work towards, that perhaps will better connect us to the kinds of landscapes that we need, the kind of spaces we need, and the kind of resilience we need to essentially survive in this changing climate. So the last thing I'm going to talk about briefly is the effort that we are thinking about as the Conservancy looks forward to 2022. We learned in a very deep way over the last 2 years, just how essential parks are. We have known that open space really was so related to our health and our mental health, but during the pandemic, it has been made all the more clear. And the fact that these park spaces can be the places where we can come together and be together safely, of all walks of life, has been, I think, further underlined for us. And during these last couple of years, as we know, Olmsted, if he were alive today, would be turning 200 in 2022. We thought a lot about, and actually I'm really pleased that Garrett has been in these conversations with us. How do we think about that anniversary year, which we would like to connect to these spaces, to our communities in an important way, but how do we do that in a way that's really relevant, understanding the time that we find ourselves in, understanding that our cities aren't healthy, and there are major racial justice challenges to this day that continue, and perhaps more people are becoming aware of in the last year. How do we not just celebrate the parks, but celebrate the values that created the parks, or try and reinvest the values that created the park in our work? And so through the process of speaking with many organizations in Boston and further, but folks that live in and around the Necklace, we talked about how these seem to fall into three areas: sort of environmental justice, public health, and racial justice. And are there ways that we can use this moment of the 200th anniversary of Olmsted's birth and use this as an opportunity to and a practice field essentially for reinvesting our thinking in Olmsted's values and how that would relate to the communities in and around Boston, and the ways that the communities can be essentially determinators, determine their future. We looked at the realities of who lives where, how the necklace can connect to BIPOC communities. Those are Black, Indigenous, people of color, children, elderly communities in and around the Emerald Necklace. How can these spaces best connect to, or are not very well connected to, those communities? Who is already in our universe? How can we take the spaces that we have and we inhabit and better connect to all of the communities surrounding the necklace, and truly see how these public spaces can empower the public to have the health, learn from the lessons of ways of managing climate, and see if these kinds of things can have a greater life through all of those that that have the right to them. So here's a couple of maps that show the Emerald Necklace on Boston and the location of BIPOC concentrations, communities, and then some of the partners that we are starting to work, both existing partners, but also some of the new partners through our Olmsted Now coalition that we have been developing. We talk about how Olmsted talked about the value of people coming together and being seen coming together, and I think that is a big part of what public space can provide us, and perhaps what being with each other in those public spaces and developing a deeper sense of empathy from others. I don't think it is a coincidence that in cities where we are closer to each other, that we have a deeper sense of empathy, and that might be what we see as there are more social programs perhaps, and things supporting each other, and so we're really trying to use this anniversary as a time to invest in those relationships and do more connecting with the communities that that at times, many times, are not invested in as much as they might be. And I guess I just wanted to end on an image from the Fog by Flow exhibit that was many things. One of those things was fun, and I think we do need to have these moments that we can come together and perhaps experience the park or a space in a new way. And I think really the thing that Kent has taught me, and that we try and do with our youth programs, and I hope we do with the Olmsted Now effort, is to find ways that we, by being in the same space together, seeing the way that nature changes, responds, handles, or is challenged by what we are visiting upon it right now, perhaps we will all work a little bit harder in our own ways to save it. So with that, I'm going to stop.
Great. Well, I guess I'll just jump right in.
Yes, please go ahead. Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. And thanks, Amy, and to the Green Ribbon Commission more generally for having us here. I'm really flattered to get to speak alongside Karen and Brenda, representatives of such great cultural institutions in Boston. But more broadly, really to think about cultural institutions not as the sort of sidekicks of a broader fight for climate justice and climate resilience, but instead in some ways at its center. And I think the conversation we're having today is not just about promoting solutions to climate change or helping sell the message that climate change is important, but actually about how cultural institutions are really key to helping us evaluate what kinds of solutions, what kinds of fights we ought to be in, and what a more just and equitable future might look like. So I'm Garrett Nelson. I'm the president and head curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are the stewards of the Boston Public Library's cartographic collections. We hold about 250,000 maps, atlases, data sets, globes, historical materials at the Central Library in Copley Square. And we also have a free to the public exhibition gallery in that space, which actually just opened past Friday after more than a year of being closed. I'd love to have any of you come by and visit us. At the Map Center, we're not interested just in maps as a particular type of historic artifact. We're really interested in how we understand the world through a geographic lens, how we think about people as being situated in particular places and landscapes and communities that have a geographic context, and they're structured by space. And that theme is very much a central kind of question, or a central topic for our upcoming 2022 exhibition, More or Less in Common, which I'm going to talk about a bit today. Instead of kind of just giving you the sales pitch for what this exhibition is about, I actually want to take you through a little bit of a puzzle of a story, a geographic puzzle. What you see here is a map that the federal EPA uses for identifying environmental justice communities. It's a kind of boring looking web map called EJ Screen. And what we're looking at here is the area around the Chelsea Creek between East Boston and Chelsea in Massachusetts, which is one of the greater Boston area's key environmental justice areas. This map looks at factors ranging from racial status to income, language isolation, to identify communities that might be particularly harmed or vulnerable to a number of environmental threats. And the puzzle here is, how did the geography of Greater Boston get to be like this? Why is it that along Chelsea Creek we find a concentration of minority communities, of poor communities, of people who have been socially, economically, and politically placed on the vulnerable edge of environmental hazards? If you look at a map of income, you see the same thing. So it's not merely a question of environmental justice screen, but a broader question about how privilege and disprivilege get structured into space. And we've had a lot of important national conversations in the past several years about racial justice, about other questions about who has what and who doesn't. And I think one important context for all of these discussions is the way that geography and place and the things that we can see on a map become ways of crystallizing these forms of injustice and holding on to them, perpetuating these inequalities for longer than they might otherwise persist in a just society. Now, the Map Center, we think over long periods of time, how did the Chelsea Creek get to be this way? This is one of the earliest maps of the greater Boston region from the very beginning of the 19th century. See, Boston is still a peninsula here, and the Chelsea Creek is one of the many low-lying intertidal estuary zones that was on the periphery of Boston. That's one of the reasons why Boston was an attractive place for white colonization when Europeans arrived in the 17th century. These tidal flats offered ecological and military opportunities for white settlers. And almost immediately, the processes of injustice began. This is a 1638 deed that's in the BPL collections, by which the native peoples who are living on Noddle's Island, now called East Boston, quitclaimed their tenancy on that island and essentially signed it over to the white colonizers, beginning a process of alienation, enclosure, environmental transformation that continued for centuries. In the early 18th century, Chelsea itself was set apart from Boston by an act of the state legislature here in 1738. That municipal dividing line, of course, is still there today. We still, who you vote for, where you pay your taxes, who has municipal authority over you on one side of this creek or the other is still determined by this 1738 line. And very quickly in the 19th century, these low-lying areas immediately on the peripheries of the industrial city became sites of industrial extraction, of capitalist exploitation, of commercial speculation. Here we see a map of East Boston from 1844, where Noddle's Island had begun to be gridded, platted out, and the low-lying lands around the island converted into saleable property. The Chelsea Creek seemed like an ideal place on the margins of the industrial city to bring in industrial infrastructure, like you see here in our Atlascope tool, which is a really great kind of web discovery interface for peeking behind a modern map and looking at the historical legacy that is still very much encrusted into the modern day landscape. We're looking through a modern map here into 1874, where you can already see where the rail lines were brought into these low-lying areas. Beginnings of a petrochemical industry were being developed along the creek. You can actually see in the middle of the map here, oil tanks already being built in the 1870s. And of course, you see on the modern map, the modern legacies of that heavy industry. That connection of social and ecological marginality and vulnerability has been a part of this area's history for years and years. At the beginning of the 20th century in 1908, the Chelsea Oil Works burned. They were rebuilt, but of course, this is the same time that elite landscapes like the Emerald Necklace, like the park systems of wealthy cities like cities and towns like Brookline are being built. And the inequalities that were inherent to the late Gilded Age in the late 19th and early 20th centuries became more and more structured by where people were, whether you live next to a burning oil plant or whether you live next to a beautifully designed park system by one of the world's great landscape architects had very much to do with who you were and what sort of social, economic, and racial power you had. Over time, Chelsea Creek continued to be turned into what might be called a kind of sacrifice zone or an ecological crisis site. It's still the site of many of Boston's oil transshipment facilities. Here's an aerial photograph from 1948. And one of the things we think a lot about is how these kind of topological and topographical features are not just coincidentally related to social patterns, but really intimately structure them. The fact that this was a low-lying estuary, an easy place to build kind of cheap, toxic land uses, and then the types of people who had nowhere else to live except on the margins of such a landscape are a process of historical co-construction. Now, this isn't just a story about Boston, and really I would say one of the challenges with environmental justice is thinking about it not just as a local story of fights over, where to place a park or where to place an oil receiving facility. Here's a photograph of the Niger Delta in West Africa, site of years and years of oil spills and really like deeply inhumane treatment of local populations in order to produce the oil that arrives in a place like Chelsea Creek and flows through the pipes and gas tanks of people all throughout Massachusetts and New England. So linking together these local and international struggles in a single thread of environmental degradation, exploitation, and social hazard is really a key to this story. That fossil-powered industry has consequences on the neighborhood beyond just the transshipment facilities and the toxic waste they bring. Here's Logan Airport, one of the biggest users of fossil fuels in Massachusetts, and its noise contours. Of course, again, the people living here are directly in the flight paths of Massachusetts' most busy airport. And so their lives are shaped in more ways than one by a kind of global economic oil system. Now, notice up until this point, I haven't said the word climate change once, and that's intentional. I think we tend to think of climate change as a late 20th century problem, a problem of cars and the hockey stick graph and modern technical solutions to that crisis. But as we now know, the places that are most vulnerable to some of the challenges of climate change are the ones that have historically, for centuries, been placed at the edges of this kind of ecological and social vulnerability. As here in a 2017 article from WBOR, looking at this very same landscape on Chelsea Creek and the kinds of communities that are bracing for changing sea level rises, climate events, worsened storms, hurricanes, and ways have been made marginal by these processes of exclusion. But of course, our solutions to climate change tend to not only ignore, but be totally naive to these historical injustices. Massachusetts should be praised in one sense for taking the lead on things like incentivizing electric vehicles. But this chart, which shows that almost all of those subsidies have gone to very wealthy communities like Belmont, Newton, Weston, shown here, suggests that our prevailing approach to what we'll do about climate change still does nothing to address these questions of alienation, of injustice, of lack of opportunity, and really of thinking about what we do to the environment as a social story, as something that has as much to do with what we do to each other as to what we do to some inert environment that surrounds us. The literary critic Rob Nixon has a quote that we talk about in our introduction to this show. We may all be in the Anthropocene, of course, that term referring to this global moment where humanity has reconstructed and reshaped the global environment in its image. But as Nixon notes, we are not all in it in the same way. Similarly, the writer C.S. Lewis, more than half a century ago, a quote saying, "What we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument." We might, of course, take out C.S. Lewis's gendered language, but nevertheless, think about how environmental destruction and environmental solutions will always be a question of who has power over others and in what way. So those are the questions that we're really going to be taking on in our 2022 exhibition, more or less in common. You've heard from both Brenda and from Karen, one of our sort of most important ways of thinking about exhibitions is in relation to the communities around us. We have a very active K-12 education program here at the center. And so thinking about how this exhibition is not just something to come and look at and to pose the kinds of questions which I've just shared with you right now, but instead a collaborative process with communities themselves that frankly forces people to confront challenging and difficult things, like why is Belmont and Newton getting all of the EV subsidies, and what might just transition, a way of confronting climate change look like that didn't just think about questions about justice and social equality as sort of add-ons or secondary parts of this challenge, but really as a central challenge for what we do with the human environment. I promised I'd only take 10 minutes. I think I've tried to keep to that, but I'll direct you both to our website at leventhalmap.org, our social media, BPL Maps, if you want to learn more about the exhibition. We're really pleased that this will be during the Olmsted Bicentennial year of Olmsted 200, and we see this exhibition as very much in dialogue with some of the other activities that are going on in cultural institutions that year. So thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Garrett. And that was, I love the fact that you got most of the way through the presentation without saying climate change, because I think sometimes I think I'm guilty of this, just talk about climate change sort of ad nauseum, and really it's about how is it affecting people? You know, it's not just an abstract idea. I'll also just mention, I put this in the chat, there was an editorial or an op-ed, I guess, in the Globe yesterday by Ayanna Presley and Roseanne Bongiovanni, I think I might have that name wrong, who's the head of Green Roots in Chelsea, talking about just saying the same things that you just said. Nothing has changed there, or very little has changed. There's great environmental injustice still going on over there. So let me open this up to the audience for questions. Please put them in the chat. I encourage you, there's some questions in there already. And I will scroll through and go back to the ones that came in earlier. But let me also just start by saying, does any of you, Garrett, Karen, Brenda, have comments on each other's, having listened to each other's presentation? Is there anything you want to dive in and say? Because I'd love for this to be a conversation. Don't forget to unmute or.
I really appreciate the ways in which Karen and Garrett tapped into sort of social justice issues and the ways in which it shows up in the landscape, in nature, and it's even more sort of it underscores the need to have diverse and interdisciplinary and intergenerational dialogue happening and activations happening to address these issues. And I say that too because, you know, it's, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu, right? Hearing this sort of historical narrative of injustice and the ways in which it is in alignment with how climate change has impacted almost unevenly certain parts of our ecosystem really speaks to the necessity of both a literacy of climate change for diverse audiences, but also, again, ensuring that the people at the table are those that are most proximate to the ways in which our neighborhoods and communities are deeply impacted by climate change. So I'm so grateful for the really thoughtful articulation of how justice issues or injustice directly align with the topic under discussion.
Thank you.
I wanted to say, Brenda, I think it's really neat, both your new position as at the head of an organization that has science and culture in its name, and the way you're thinking about Thoreau. Thoreau himself comes from a moment before science and culture were these two totally separate kind of conceptual categories, right? And I really love how you're engaging with sort of citizen science as something that somebody like Thoreau would have practiced in the 19th century, but that still is alive with us today. And I think that, you know, kind of giving a sort of concrete reality, right? Noticing when trees are leafing out, noticing how one's community is changing with the seasons and things like that is a really neat way of grounding the sort of scientific method. One of the things that annoys me is when you have like a clip art for science and it's like somebody a lab coat with a beaker and like that's all science is, right? And I really love the way that your exhibition invites us to kind of think about science in a different way. And one that's not unlike in some ways the questions Karen posed about community and the places where people come together to figure something out, right? What is science but an attempt to sort of socially figure something out together? And I think there's some real interesting overlap there in terms of like thinking about collective decision making and collectively understanding or kind of analyzing the world for solutions.
I think the rise of citizen science is we're seeing that now across Boston. I know the Museum of Science and you know, and other groups are doing a lot with heat mapping, with literally going out and taking temperature at different places, the tree canopy. So, you know, that's such an important way to engage people to create really what I believe is needed, which is political demand for change, more, you know, more vocal, more pointed political demand. Not that it's lost on us that today is the mayoral primary election in Boston. So I'm glad it's a beautiful day and everybody's out there. Karen, do you want to chime in? And also I was going to ask you if you could just give us a little more on what insight he had that really changed the thinking about the function of green space in a city?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, one thing I am reflecting on a little bit is, well, number one, I think that the Green Ribbon Commission's, great idea is that let's not build a huge museum that talks about climate change. Let's see how everyone is engaging all of their entire audience and connecting connecting people to this conversation. And I think that I'm sure that so many people are, tuning in today that are, perhaps related to or work for an institution that they don't think is in the conversation about climate change. But I think the point is absolutely everybody is. And, when you turn the lights on where you live, or when, somebody comes and how they travel there, and every, every piece of art or element of an institution is all sort of in concert, in conversation with all these forces and systems around us. So there are ways to sort of bring this in small and large ways. And I think it's pretty exciting to be able to be part of that conversation. Olmsted and the history of the Olmsted parks are not a perfect legacy. So I don't want, I think a lot of times there is this real a tendency to hold up inventors, practitioners, designers, and sort of say, talk about them and what they did as sacrosanct. Certainly, we know that the site on which Central Park was developed, which was developed for a lot of reasons, one of which was real estate, desire to increase value of real estate, but also, health and other reasons. But it forced out Seneca Village, one of the, most important areas of sort of African American free people living in New York and owning land and having some amount of self-determination. So I think this is complex, and I don't want to just talk about the perfection of Olmsted, but I do think that he had a deep sense that number one, being in nature was good for you. Like, it was physically good for you before people are studying it. And that's, another, if for no other reason, climate change is a real problem, there should be less of it, and we need it, and it's really important for our health. He really seemed to understand that. He talked about, being in open spaces or green spaces as providing an enhanced sense of freedom. And I think, that kind of a sense of self-empowerment and being able to sort of think about what should, my life be about, who, and, how should these spaces, be healthy and be part of a better city or a place to live. I think, that is sort of empowering and freeing. And I think it's sometimes in these spaces that we get these creative ideas. And I think, bringing many people together, we get those better ideas and moments of discovery. There a scientist that discovered, part of the sort of CRISPR. There's a part of science now that it splices genes and does interesting thing with genes. Was thinking about it as he was walking through the Emerald Necklace, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I haven't asked for residuals, but I do think that there's something to that, sort of being in these spaces and the freedom that your mind is able to have, and learning from nature obviously is the way we're going to solve this, by sort of following the ways, the systems that these things create. Amy, I don't know if that was precisely answering your question or talking a lot around it, but I do think that we have a lot of opportunity between the institutions that we all have a place in to see how we can connect and tell these stories, and even tell someone a little something that they hadn't thought about the way that they impacted the world, or the world impacted their truth and their reality. And I think there's something really, really powerful in the mapping work that Garrett does, sort of explaining that story.
Thank you. That was beautifully said. There's also this empathy, and I can't remember in our pre-discussion we talked about the importance of developing empathy and why that matters and what nature can teach us about that. And I think was it Brenda you were talking about that, or was it you, Karen? Whoever it was.
I think we all mobilizing around the idea of empathy and how cultural institutions can be good stewards of both information and empathy. My hope is that our exhibitions are certainly ones that center on climate change, are using creative approaches like arts integration as a way to tap into the more emotive component of one's sort of visitor experience, if you will. But also it really is about creating, helping our visitors become more proximate to climate change as a topic, but the very pedestrian contours of it. It's not this sort of atmospheric a thing, if you will, right? But that it's in view. It's in our day to day. And there's a geographer who encourages visitors to any place to read the landscape. One can read the landscape to really see how climate change is a very visual, a very pedestrian part of our lived experience.
I think that's so important. And that's back what I was saying at the beginning. If it stays in the realm of, tons of greenhouse gas and scientific reports, that's great for a relatively small set of people. And the rest of us need other ways that are more practical and daily to relate. Let me go to some of the questions now in the chat. So the first one up is for you, Brenda. How can museums and libraries use your Thoreau exhibition as a model? You have such rich collections here. How can others build these partnerships? And what have you learned while developing the exhibition?
Yeah, well, I have to say I'm fairly new to the project and to the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. I've been in my position for about 3 months, but what has been deeply important to our strategy for community engagement is building on those pre-existing relationships, right? Having built the trust, building relationships with public libraries in particular and with school districts have been critical to engaging with community members writ large. And so in that regard, this exhibition will be another opportunity to interface with those partners in a very thoughtful manner, and using climate change as a way to develop greater proximity to nature. And using art as a way to essentially provide a different vocabulary, a different entry point for engaging with the topic. So being creative in the approach, but also again, building on those existing relationships that provide a conduit through which you're able to engage with the larger communities that you serve. And we have to be particularly intentional being on a college campus. You do have in some ways a visitor base that is quite proximate, students, faculty, researchers on your campus. But I think it's important in some ways, for the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture to be a front porch, symbolic of creating this important conduit between community and campus. And I think an exhibit like In Search of Thoreau's Flowers is one way to sort of create this very interesting dialectic between community and campus, and dealing with a topic that impacts both, frankly, in some important ways.
And you said the exhibit is still sort of in the planning phase. So are you open to other institutions or ideas still?
I definitely think that we're open to partnerships that will allow us to connect the exhibition and, most importantly, the targeted issues that we're looking at with larger community partners, for sure. We do, I think what we've done is been very intentional about engaging both the scholarly community at Harvard and artists outside of the Harvard community to really build an interdisciplinary approach. So the approach is quite fixed, but what our hope is a catalyst for greater engagement and partnership. So absolutely.
Great. And so note, I'll direct you to a note from Rainy Bench in the chat about the Mount Desert Island Historical Society in Maine. You probably know about that with the historical diaries. Okay.
Absolutely.
So I think everyone, I don't know, can everyone see that, Claire or Lizzie? Can everyone see the what's in the chat? Because that one is worth capturing and sending out.
Absolutely.
So let me see here.
Amy, I'd love to just ask, I am not an expert at empathy. I am not a psychologist, but I do think there's something really important about empathy right now at this moment, where we see a lot of conversations about what I do for my body, or what I do for my community, or how these things relate. And I mean, I guess I would love to ask the other panelists, how we can think about our institutions as ways to develop empathy in others, because that is the solution to a lot of these things. Like if an island and a bunch of folks die or parts of Boston are too hot because there aren't enough trees, we would care about that. Why would we care about that? We care about it because other people are being affected. And if we don't see our relationship, we don't see everyone on the planet as our neighbor or members of our community, that's inherently the problem. So how do we, I don't know, I struggle with this too. I mean, I think part of it is perhaps you can, when people come together, they can connect and they develop that. But I think we are in a major crisis of this. And I think politicians have been talking about it, others have been talking about it. And I don't really know. I mean, religion, I think, was a way that we thought we all got there, or maybe, but it doesn't seem to be working anymore. So I don't know if anyone has a solution for this.
If I can just tag on to that, Karen, and I'm curious what you and Brenda and the whole group thinks. But one thing I can't help wonder about is what's the sort of relationship between empathy and its sort of inverse, whether that's anger or frustration, right? It's hard not to feel empathetic about one's own community, or a community as far flung as in the Niger Delta, and to see what's going on and to not feel angry about that, right? And if you look historically at powerful social movements, whether it's the American Revolution or abolition or the Civil Rights Movement, right? They combined a sense of community feeling with a sense of outrage or anger, right? And what is our responsibility as cultural institutions to channel that or give a voice to it, right? It's not just about tweaks and statistics and a kind of clinical approach, but that there is really a kind of a social mandate to address kind of these things because we're angry about it. And I'm curious how you all are thinking about that in your beyond just the exhibitions.
I think that is the $1 million quandary, right? Is not only how do you leverage sort of knowledge production, but how do you actually promote empathy? And I think you really tapped into it, Garrett, when you talked about, in some ways, the heart is community. And when you can build relationships between community members and the spaces that they live in every day, it's not atmospheric. It's not some sort of abstract thing, right? It is their neighborhood. It is their community. It is their life source in a particular way. And I think the more we can, I'm not simply just interested in Again, I think museums aren't just these cabinets of curiosity where people come and look at things and immerse themselves in the experience. I'm really interested in how that information activates our visitors to engage with the world around them in more authentic, intentional, and more empathetic ways. And so part of it is getting proximate to the communities that you live in, and really being able to sort of make sense of the impact on something like climate change on your community directly. I mean, again, I think we're all so, it's if we just read the landscape, it is around us, in and out, right? And so the opportunity to explore our individual neighborhoods as a case study, if you will, is one way to sort of create a bit of sort of emotional relationship with nature, with community, with one's surrounding environments.
So when we were first thinking about forming the Cultural Institutions Working Group of the Green Ribbon Commission, because our other working groups are focused on healthcare, higher education, and commercial real estate. So this one was a little bit of a different animal. It was sort of the nucleus of the idea was that we wanted to create, we wanted to activate and create political will long-term for the changes we knew were going to be difficult and expensive coming down the pike. For the city to protect ourselves against climate change and transition to a post-carbon economy. And so the idea was that unless you won't act if you don't care, and you won't care if your emotions aren't touched in some way. And that was sort of like, how do we touch people's emotions? Who's best situated in the city to do that consistently over time? And it was clearly cultural institutions that, lots of different exhibits, everything's going to hopefully touch somebody at some point and cause that germ to be created, that germ that will lead to caring, to acting, and to demanding change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how I think about it. It was almost like a neuroscience idea. How do you create a new neural pathway? So I want to get back to a couple of the questions here. So one is, this is fascinating. This is actually, I think, relates to what we're talking about. Rosemary, and I will not attempt your last name. I am seeing writing haiku as a way to access our connection to the issues you're talking about. And the Arnold Arboretum has worked with haiku, and any chance that any of your organizations have worked with haiku or poetry, I guess I'll broaden it a little bit.
I know with our youth, we have a couple of different youth programs. We have a teen program where we ask the students to journal, and actually Kent has the students develop a sit spot, so a spot that they go to and return to regularly and write. And I don't know about haiku particularly, but certainly write and reflect and sort of connect with what matters.
Absolutely. And I can speak from, sort of my own sort of body of work writ large as a museum practitioner. I've often asked students to read the landscape. It tells us so much about the social, racial, socioeconomic realities of the communities that we live in. And certainly it tells us so much about the ways in which nature is impacted by human activity. And so whether it be, is there a Starbucks and a grocery store? What does that tell you about a particular area? Is there if there isn't a grocery store nearby, what does it tell you about sort of access to produce, to food sources? The very idea of food insecurity becomes a live detail when you're reading the landscape. And certainly that kind of activity is a metacognitive one that encourages one to make sense of the communities. And I'm using plural because we all sort of know that as we move through any given city, any given landscape, you almost move through multiple communities. And when you're reading the landscape, you see that. You see those sort of polarizations that separate cities.
I think the ability to closely observe is something artists teach us, scientists teach us, map makers teach us, city planners teach us. And without that, we don't notice anything without that power. So on the topic of language, here's a question from Stacy Ross about a high school environmental club and seeking the right language to incorporate climate into it. Can you provide some suggestions for a good title or group to start up that looks at this empathy, environment, and climate change question at the high school level, ages 13 to 17? Anyone have ideas on that?
Well, I'm not sure if this is the right term for your club, though it could be, but we deliberately chose the word human landscape rather than environment in the title of this exhibition. I happen to think that's a very the word landscape itself is really interesting because it refers to places that people have shaped, right? And we tend to think of landscape as parks and trees and those sorts of things, but industrial sacrifice zones are landscapes, public housing communities are landscapes, like bicycle paths are landscapes. Like the ways that people have shaped the world, and that word shape is literally in the word landscape. That's one of the reasons that I like it as a reminder of the ways that the environment isn't something that just sort of surrounds us or is somehow apart from our social and cultural lives, but it's really made by that life. So that word has been one for us that opens up some questions. Brenda has talked so eloquently about reading the landscape as a way of engaging with the environment around us. So I'd suggest that one as one to think with at the very least, even if it's not.
So repeat it for us again. Human landscape.
The way the word landscape makes us think in different ways than environment does, which environment I think tends to have a more kind of clinical or scientific ring to it.
And what about the words climate change? Rainey's asking, is there pushback? And I guess this is to all of us, is you get pushback on the use of the term climate change?
I don't think, I guess I'm going to say that I think if we think that maybe one way to connect more people to this is not necessarily using the word climate change, but instead sort of understanding the relationships between people. I mean, should the program be called like I am you or you are me or like we're the same or something? Like it's just about like sort of people identifying with each other and like, community and words about people and relationship and less of, and then that will lead to an understanding of, of how we impact and change things. I mean, I think there is something very empowering about learning that, these spaces and where we live and how we live was, is a result of people's previous actions, and they can be a result of new actions, and I think there is potentially a value to that.
I think what Karen and Garrett have both sort of brought in sharp focus is the dialectic that happens between people and nature. That this idea of landscape, which Garrett so thoughtfully talked about as, the idea of shaping, that humans help shape the landscape. And frankly, what we're learning is that the landscape shapes us too. It determines our quality of life in a particular way. And so when we're not taking care of the landscape, what happens? And that's sort of the probably one of the most stirring questions, right? When we're not taking care of the landscape, what happens? As human beings, what happens?
Yeah, interesting. And related to that, Barb from your museum actually has a question, Barb Bowden, about helping people handle the emotional load that comes with this complex and impactful and heavy, frankly, topic. I mean, we could talk about managing landscape, and then you read the latest IPCC report, it says it's a red alert for humanity. I mean, that's just like to me, that's like soft language, poetic language, and then it's like emergency flashing light, break the glass kind of language. And, you know, I think both are appropriate in different situations, but both of them carry heavy content, probably especially the break the glass one. And you know, what are your thoughts on helping people to handle the emotional load, I guess is the real question.
I saw that question and something sort of similar to this. And I mean, I think we have to have friends. And I think that's what we as cultural institutions can help people find, you know, and communities within that. And one thing I didn't mention about Olmsted now, which I think is important, is that our effort with this anniversary is about investing in neighborhoods, communities, and individuals. So the program that we are producing or supporting or working with funders to support is putting you know, small and larger grants in the hands of community members that already have ways that they get together and celebrate their spaces and come together and act locally, either, you know, to have a community conversation about their school, or have a community conversation about something, or fix a part of their park, or talk about, you know, and it is determined by communities. And I think the way that this feels less overwhelming is if you have a set of neighbors that you work with together cleaning your park, you know, or that you know because you all think about your, you know, help volunteer at your school, or you sort of have a network that you feel like you together can do something that adds up to a better situation. And there is that expression, you know, act locally, you know, and I do think that ultimately that's just the only way we're going to get there, is going to have to be a million of little small actions. And it can feel incredibly overwhelming unless you have this community. So I think there was a question in the chat I saw about exhibits and how do you do this with exhibits? I think you know, I don't know. I don't run reviews. I know a lot about exhibits, but I know that if we can create programs and opportunities for people to be together and connect to each other, then that can, you know, go forward. And there's probably are ways to do that through exhibits or through other programs.
And Karen, what I also heard you say is creating partnerships and networks, and in some ways that creates a sort of kinship in you know, engaging with nature and in keeping your communities safe and clean. And it's an investment that you're doing with other community members, with other stakeholders. And I think that's such a deeply important perspective, very important perspective. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that type of action is really important to get away from the sort of, you know, like lifestyle tweak form of environmental change, right? Which I think can be alienating because it's so individual and feels so inappropriately scaled to the challenge, right? Like, how is sorting my recycling gonna you know, change the global climate? But there's huge power, I think, when people get together and feel like they're doing something together. That the word common was another one we deliberately chose for the show, both because that refers to a type of place in Boston, a very famous public landscape, but thinking about what do we have in common, and also how are we kept apart, right? How has social difference and inequality kept us oftentimes artificially apart and unable to partake in common action? And what might be possible if we did think about our environmental fates as being kind of in common and having some sort of ability, social solidarity to work across class, race, geographic lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's almost getting at this recent question from Douglas Wirtz. We also have to change systems. I mean, in addition to individual actions, we have to change systems and economic, social, governance, education. Do you see a role for your organizations as institutions? I think this question is getting at, you know, to either individually or to come together as a sector to have more of a political voice.
Mm.
Well, I think I can give one example. Right now, the Conservancy is engaged in a complex dialogue about the use of a portion of what was originally Franklin Park. And then a hospital was built on it, and now the state has determined the hospital will be demolished, and we're hopeful that some of that land could be returned to park use. But there's also a really important need to build housing for the formerly homeless, and trying to work with all of the various public agencies and look at, available public land and how to make these smart, complex decisions act on systems, be part of a productive dialogue that is difficult. Like, because that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with wanting to satisfy a lot of different important needs within these systems that have built over time. And it's not easy, especially for a 501c3 like the Conservancy. We aren't political, but we do want to work to restore the park and support the neighborhoods that need more open space. And sometimes it means we have to start trying to work on city planning and sort of bigger questions that maybe aren't the scale that we normally work on. We're seeing more and more institutions divesting from fossil fuel investments and saying we're not going to use our endowments in those ways. I mean, I think it's not simple or straightforward, but I think those are all things that we're starting to do. And I think just these partnerships and dialogues are a big part of maybe looking a little closer at some of the choices or the systems that we're part of.
I do think that there's a role for cultural institution. I think one of the great challenges in American life is this idea that you get an education for 18 or 21 years, and then you just kind of freeze what you learn there and keep it, education ends at that point. Of course, museums, cultural institutions, libraries are one of the great opportunities to think about education as continuing beyond childhood, right? And I think those are both the biophysical science as well as questions like environmental justice are new and changing and constantly in a state of flux and being reconsidered from multiple perspectives. And so inviting not only children, but adults and people from all walks of life to think in different ways in an educational setting, I think is really a mandate in some ways for these kinds of institutions, because there are no other institutions doing that kind of work.
Right. Yeah, and you think about the fabric of the city of Boston, you think, oh, well, we need our hospitals, and of course, we need our universities. I mean, what would Boston be without its cultural institutions? We would be shells of ourselves, right? And so there is also this kind of self-preservation mandate. So these, you have buildings and you have collections and you have grounds and you have trees in some cases, and there's a need to protect yourselves from the sea level rise and the heat and the drought and the rain and the flooding. I think that is going to take some political activation on the part of this sector. This is just my view of it. Let's see. I think we have time for maybe one more last words round from each of you, if you want to make one, and then I want to just say a word about our next upcoming GRCx, and then we'll close. Garrett, you have the floor.
Sure. Well, it's really inspiring to hear the work that these institutions are doing, and to hear feedback from so many people on the Zoom as well about different ways of engaging. I do think that continuing to sort of push at some of the categories in which we've assumed climate action will take place, right? As if it will just be a policy lever, or just be technical innovations in green energy, or if it will just be large institutions, tweaking their building footprints and things like that. Thinking about it as really this defining struggle that goes beyond just the term climate change and has everything to do with how we want to organize our common life together, right? Not something that's outside of us, not something that we can set into some sort of self-contained box. And that's why I think having it be situated in places the way the Emerald Necklace Conservancy is doing it, tying it together with history and literature and culture, like Brenda has discussed. I think that's just such important work.
Thank you very much. And then Karen, maybe quickly.
Yes, I just saw in the chat a comment about how, how we do this in people's leisure time. And I guess I would challenge that assumption. I think the Emerald Necklace in its linear nature is a commuting corridor. It's a transportation corridor. It's how our water is managed and processed. It is not something that people only visit to relax. It is part of our daily lives. And I think all of the landscapes that surround us are sort of how we move through our lives. And, perhaps we can think about, how these spaces are organized or shaped that we can be better stewards of, of the climate and is a big part of what we do. So I would say that perhaps we can think a little bit less about sort of visiting a place as sort of, this is the place we're in. How do we help, how do we and this place, mutually benefit each other differently? And that is something that I think we get to through empathy. So I think all the institutions like the two that I am privileged to be around today, if we teach people to connect to some other story other than their own and see themselves in it, we have gone a little bit further down the road, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then Brenda, just a word.
Yeah, one of my words that I live by is a quote by Alice Walker, and she said that people are known by the records they keep. If it isn't in the record, it will be said that it did not happen. That's what history is, a keeping of records. And our greatest record is nature. It is telling us so much about our history, about our present, and about our future. And if we don't take heed, we will find ourselves in not only a very cumbersome situation, but the landscape that we shape and that shapes us may no longer be. And so I think it's really important that we be good stewards, that we read and listen to the landscape, and that we activate ourselves to be better stewards of her.
I cannot improve on your words or Alice Walker's either. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to all three of you. This has been very rich and we've learned a lot. We look forward to all three of the exhibitions coming in the spring of 22, which will all be part of the action-packed citywide culture and climate initiative that the Green Ribbon Commission is organizing. And our next GRCx program is on climate change, past, present, and future, how different perspectives on time affect our responses. And I think this is going to be another very fascinating look at sort of like, why isn't our hair on fire? How do we think about risk? How do we think about time? And how have different cultures over the past perhaps responded differently to the same kinds of pressures, albeit maybe not quite as strongly man-made. Thanks to the audience for coming today, and we will see you next time.